Good afternoon. It's Inna here from Digestive Reset. I want to introduce Dr. Aly Cohen. Welcome to Real Health Solutions, Dr. Aly.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, most welcome, our pleasure. So Dr. Aly Cohen is a rheumatologist, integrative medicine, and environmental health specialist. What interests me the most is your passion for integrative medicine. I pay close attention to it working with my chronic digestive clients. Please tell me more about you, your practice, your background.
Thank you, Inna, Dr. Inna, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. I think it's called the Crohn's and Colitis Fix. So anyway, that's wonderful, and I'll be using it in my practice as well. So I began as, in medical training and went through and was trained in internal medicine and then a fellowship in rheumatology in the New York area. And later felt that there was not enough information going to patients regarding nutrition and sleep, and many of the integrative approaches that maybe most people don't know are called integrative, but we're talking sleep, stress management, diet and nutrition, and supplements if necessary, acupuncture, biofeedback, a whole host of other supportive measures for health. So I went back for training, actually got a scholarship to work with Dr. Andrew Weil.
Amazing.
It was timely and lucky. So fortunately they had a spot for rheumatology scholarship. And so that was a 2-year program, also supported by a board certification. So it is actually a board certified specialty to do that type of testing and make sure people are adequately trained. And so that has dramatically influenced my ability to care for patients, both rheumatologic and non-rheumatologic patients that come to see me, because I see a whole host of diagnoses, including Parkinson's and children with issues, MS, other autoimmune diseases. And then, of course, there's the environmental health aspect of what I've now got to over the last 7 or 8 years, which is how the environment and components of the environment, such as drinking water contaminants, air pollutants, personal care product chemicals, cleaning products, everyday exposures can really affect long-term health issues. And I think yet again that was another piece that was missing in the holistic care of my patients.
I see. Yes. And in chronic digestive patients, we also get to the root cause and figure out a lot of toxicities that's why I wanted to bring it. That's why a lot of my clients are so excited to hear your interview. Yeah. So can you tell me a little more about your journey originally? What made you in science all until now? How did you come to be so interested and passionate about environmental medicine?
It's kind of an interesting story. Everyone has a reason to get to where they are, right?
I have mine for sure.
Exactly. So actually what ended up happening, this is a true story. My golden retriever dog, who was, I guess about 4.5 years old at the time, got very sick, and we ended up finding out that he had autoimmune hepatitis, which you don't see in dogs, but you certainly don't see in this particular breed of dogs. And, we were quite heartbroken. This is my firstborn, technically speaking.
Yeah.
And as I was researching his environment, assuming that I had something to do with either, the food that he had been given, or the toys he was playing with, or the farmland we live in terms of pesticides, as I was researching, the potential causes of his illness, I actually unveiled a whole host of information about human regulation, lack of legislation, regulation on many of the chemicals in our environment. And it really opened up a Pandora's, box of unanswered questions for me in terms of human health. So his passing, his life really is part of why I move forward to do what I'm doing. And I often, reference my dog as sort of the start of my whole career. So in this area, so true story, and he's still with me. So
for sure, that is such a sensitive story, and I'm talking to Russell about getting a dog. I can't wait, and my previous interview with Kiran Krishnan, who's microbiologist, and he did suggest that getting a dog can bring such a great diversity to your microbiome at home.
Fantastic. And there's plenty of studies showing that in terms of, I mean, I have such a love for the discussion of the gut microbiome in terms of how to influence it in many ways. And certainly from an environmental health standpoint, we should be thinking of that as well, which we'll get into. But animals, I would say dirty kids is like my favorite thing on earth, because my boys are running around and they're all the time filthy and we're yelling at them to shower. But in fact, studies have shown that children growing up in farm environments, minus the pesticide issue, but or with pets, or have been vaginally birthed if possible, and there's no obviously reason to do it otherwise. All of those exposures really do increase the the strength and resiliency of the gut microbiome, the gut environment in terms of bacteria, the good bacteria, and so has led to a whole host of reduction in risk for allergies and various autoimmune areas in terms of atopic dermatitis and even type 1 diabetes. So, we know that having pets and having pet dander and having the bacteria that they bring into the home can be very helpful in many ways.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. And tell us, who do you think is most vulnerable to the toxins, pollutions, chemicals? What kind of patient, young, old, sick?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And in my work, it really points to the vulnerability of certain age groups, particularly a growing fetus. That is a very, very, very important part of exposure when it comes to any environmental chemicals, of course, nutrition and everything else, but certainly from an environmental chemical perspective and how those chemicals get onto the mom's skin or in the mom's food, food additives, air quality chemicals that get through, breathing of the mom. So the development of a fetus is critical, and we now have plenty of studies to show that those exposures do exist, and the placenta is actually not as hardy as we would love to believe it is in terms of keeping those chemicals on the outside world, or at least in the mom's world instead of the fetus's world. That being said, we also have other areas of growth and development that are dramatic, and that would be young childhood, toddlers, infants. We also have teenage years, which is the kind of work I'm doing with high school students. They are, teenagers are going through a whole host of hormonal and growth and developmental changes, cognitive changes as well, decision-making. Those are the types of thinkers we want to make smart decisions for their body. And so that's really the crux of what I'm doing for school education and collecting data on that population. They also use the most personal care products of any demographic in U.S. Economy. So again, very, very important growth and development period. And then there's also menopause. There's also other areas where we have dramatic hormonal change. And the reason hormonal change is such a key issue is that many of these chemicals are also classified as endocrine disrupting chemicals. And so wherever you have rapid growth and development and hormonal changes, be it the mother or the fetus or all of the growth spurts during, aging, those are the vulnerable periods where chemicals may have their greatest effect and ability to disrupt. So again, I believe there's certain, not I believe, the studies show that the vulnerable periods are very key, but I believe personally and in clinical medicine that we're all exposed, we're all able to change. And that's why I try to get people to think outside of these vulnerable periods, as any opportunity to reduce those exposures is really going to be helpful, not only for yourself, but for the people around you and even successive generations.
For sure. Thank you. Yes. And I notice a lot of young, very young preteens are developing much earlier than our generation used to. And there's plenty of reasons for that. And I don't think we really want to rush that.
Exactly. Because the earlier we're exposed to estrogen as women, the greater the risk for breast cancer development. And what we've seen now in plenty of studies around the world, in every country where this has been studied, believe it or not, age of menarche, or the start of women having their periods or menstruation, is actually coming earlier and earlier in age group. In 200 years ago, women would get their initiate their periods, their menstrual cycles at in the 10, 11, 12 range. I'm sorry, in the 12, 13, 14 range.
Right.
Now we see it as early as 9, 8, 9, and 10.
Yeah.
And we also see this actually in populations of African-American women and other minorities. And there's a lot of questions as why that is, but it may also be related to their exposures on multiple levels for chemicals, including personal care products.
Yeah.
So that's a real active
Dairy.
issue in the African-American community. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Very good. All right. So the topic now is GMO foods. And how do you think GMO foods increase our exposure to toxic pesticides? What would you recommend, going organic, or still are we able to still get the conventional foods? Are they okay? What's your input on that?
Okay, so so genetically modified foods, of course, are foods that have had genetic information inserted into their DNA from other species of plants, animals, and so that's the uproar. The uproar is genetically modified DNA for that plant, and it's still quite unclear. I don't think anything. It's a very controversial issue because we do have modified genes in various plants. That make, strawberries not freeze when they hit a certain temperature, and things that have really dramatically helped the population, but wouldn't be necessarily considered genetically modified, where they're taking another species and inserting those gene segments. What the issue is mostly, in my perspective, is that genetically modified fruits, vegetables, actually are linked to various pesticides that won't interact with those produce. In fact, they're designed specifically to be paired with various pesticides, such as glyphosate, for instance, is a Monsanto brand chemical. There's also 2,4-D that's very pervasive. And these chemicals are paired to genetically modified seeds. And so for nothing more than to argue that these chemicals are linked to large swaths of crops and produce that Americans and around the world that consume, we have to think about that pairing and whether or not, from a perspective of just chemical exposure, that it's worth reducing those, because we know that those chemicals are endocrine disrupting chemicals. We know that they have effects on development. We have plenty of studies from the Chamaco study, studies from California, where they've watched migrant workers and their children and their spouses, and they've followed them through in terms of exposure studies. And these are epidemiologic studies with thousands and thousands of participants watched over many, many years. So we now know that exposure to these pesticides can be really harmful, not only to children in their developmental level, their cognitive ability, their attention span, but we're also seeing links to pesticides and Parkinson's disease, which is a pretty strong link. And of course, there's a genetic component that makes people more susceptible, as with every disease issue. But we do know that that's a relatively strong association. So back to your question, I think the controversy over which foods are more healthy for you, there's, nutrient-wise, I think is still debatable given the soil that certain produce is produced in and a bunch of other factors. But we do know that non-organic produce does in fact have or use more pesticides to create that produce. And that in and of itself to me is concerning. And tied to the GMO conversation, it means that more pesticides, maybe more layers of that same pesticide because of resistance is building up in those crops year after year. So my recommendation is actually to buy organic foods when it's available. When it's available, it's not too costly for your household. If you can buy fresh, that's wonderful. But even flash frozen produce that is organic is now quite pervasive. It's in big box stores, and you can find it in the frozen section where they have a small section of organic frozen fruit and organic frozen vegetables. That brings the cost down dramatically. If you have conventional fruits and produce that you would like to use or can afford, you want to look up something called EWG, Environmental Working Group's Dirty Dozen Clean 15, which is a list that comes out every year where they test conventional, which is non-organic fruits and vegetables, to see how many pesticide residues are on the skins, and they give a list of the ones that have the least pesticide residue, which is the Clean 15, 1 through 15, and then the Dirty Dozen, which is the 1 through 12 of the most pesticide-laden choices. And I believe this year the top two were strawberries and spinach.
Often that is so.
So now we, at this point, won't touch any, if we can avoid it, we'll choose other fruits. And so that gives people who don't have access to organics a chance to make choices as well that are smarter and healthier. And of course, washing your fruits and vegetables, whether they're organic or conventional, and agitating them in 1 part vinegar to 3 parts warm, clean water, using sea salt as an abrasive. All of that is very helpful in reducing the residues of these pesticides on produce.
Yeah, that's very helpful information. I also included EWG's Clean 15 and Dirty Dozen suggestions in my book, and that's one of the things that I recommend for toxicities. And as far as even for their Clean 15 and Dirty Dozen, some experts, from what I read, suggest that even those organics compared to the conventional foods are also more contaminated because there's some pesticides, unfortunately, even in organic food now. So we should now load up still on the Clean 15 list, even with organics, much more than that list with non-organic, with Dirty Dozen. So what our next question from a lot of my readers are, if you could tell us more about hazards of plastics, chemicals in our homes, and what are your recommendations for people that are just starting to look into cleaning their homes? They're at loss. It's hard. I mean, I finished basically 2 pharmacy schools, original bachelor's degree and recently my doctorate. And so much chemistry, and I could read labels without a problem, obviously, but most people can't.
Right.
They don't understand.
Right.
I tell them the longer the list, the worse things are. But what can you tell us? What things can we do to avoid? Our homes are so important to us.
So first of all, I totally agree with you. None of us are toxicologists. None of us necessarily have any idea how to read a label, and the names are really frightening. And so I think one of the best ways to start off is instead of understanding each chemical, which is very laborious and has various pitfalls, I think one of the most important things people can do, number one, is just to not buy this stuff. So I try to teach people that avoiding these chemicals is as important as even changing out products. So in other words, when you think about cleaning your home, bringing in chemicals is a, 21st century, 20th century phenomenon of keeping our house super uber bacterial free, antibacterial, fresh smelling. They have trademark scents that we all feel like we need to buy into instead of cleaning our home. I mean, essentially the commercials look, like a dirty room, and they just spray, and everyone's happy. But the fact of the matter is that these chemicals often carry, for instance, fragrance. The word fragrance in and of itself can have up to 300 chemicals that are in there, and those are proprietary chemicals, meaning it's a secret that manufacturers in this country have a right to know, but we do not. So that is hidden chemicals that even just by looking at a label and avoiding products that have the word perfume or fragrance can eliminate or reduce many of those chemicals. And so that's a great place to start, is to avoid those products. In addition, not bringing in chemicals that, clean the carpet, just vacuuming instead. And especially with the HEPA filter, vacuum is very important because those are the type of filters that maintain and keep the dust within the machine instead of letting it fly out. Mm-hmm. Avoiding chemicals that we use for cleaning that aerate off. I mean, where do those chemicals evaporate into? It's in the air we breathe in our homes. So we want to make sure those are as limited as possible. So there are many if you're too busy to make them with just vinegar, sea salt for abrasive, warm water, lemon juice, then you can certainly buy a cleaner version of cleaning products. And that, again, you can actually look up ewg.org. And there's a cleaning product section where you can check those chemicals as well that you could find in big box stores. So again, avoiding these chemicals, not bringing them into your home, not feeling like you have to keep up with the Joneses and all of these products and cleanliness. is really going to serve your health better in terms of allergies and respiratory disease, COPD, emphysema. These chemicals often fall to the floor from couches, like flame retardant chemicals, which you can now buy couches without those chemicals. And children, back to the vulnerability issue, is they're on the ground, they're closest to the floor, they're picking up toys that stick to this dust, which is actually filled with these chemicals. And so they're getting a higher load per body weight than adults are. So they're actually, filling up with those chemicals and have higher loads of those chemicals than even adults do. So again, avoiding, not buying, not bringing them in, going with natural ingredients, HEPA filter, vacuuming quite regularly, dusting with a wet cloth that has no chemicals on it, instead of the wet cloths that have chemicals on them, which is kind of an oxymoron. Those are really, really important ways to just not even get it into your home, which you can control, as opposed to a school that you may not have access to, or your workplace. So controlling your home is really the most important place to start.
Yeah, I agree, because home is where we spend really most of our time. We don't realize, even if we have to work so many hours a day, we do spend the night there. We breathe the air. I tell people to probably invest into cleaning your air ducts. And I also remind that Clorox bleach is not the way to, it's truly to disrupt your microbiome at home and deplete you of good bacteria. And another thing I add, if I may, avoid, I don't mean to kill anybody's business, but 99-cent stores are really scary. There are like so many products there that you want to shut them.
And then there's chemical cleaners that are not even something you even heard of before. So we don't really, beyond what we already have in terms of lack of regulation on our already, disastrous legislation for cleaning products and chemicals in this country, we have a whole host of new ones that are entering in without any regulations from other countries. So I do agree with you, especially, toys that come from 99-cent stores, any materials or chemicals, and, we have to be jewelry that kids chew on. All of those are very, very harmful. We have to be very careful about that, because there are some legislative changes that went on with children's toys in this country. So we want to get newer toys. We don't want to get old toys or hand-me-downs or toys from, 99-cent store, because toys for kids should be safe.
Yes, and we're gonna fight for that. Okay, so now that the spring is here and all these pesticides are around us, and they're sprayed in the grass, and I'm concerned about being surrounded by all these pesticides where I live. What are your recommendations for cleaner lawns, for cleaner homes, and the pesticides that are entering the homes? I personally don't use any pesticides for our lawn, but all my neighbors around are using them. So what's to do?
Well, I think on a personal note, I agree with you. I'm struggling that with my neighbors as well. And we live on a farm that actually is in the corner of 200 acres of glyphosate farmed farmland, which is to some degree out of our control. However, we have a relationship with the farmer, and we know when they're going to spray. We try to, get out of town for a day or two. And I think that's been very helpful. But the idea is that people really do believe they should keep up with the Joneses, that whole expression of having the nicest lawn in the neighborhood or the least amount of weeds. And is there a social construct by which you're a bad person if you have, sort of unkept lawn? I think when if you keep your lawn short and you have it regularly mowed, I don't think anyone's really looking to see whether there's weeds there or grass blades. And that's been my experience. I think people just are very mechanically connected to these lawn services without really looking at the little white sign that's now on their front lawn that says, with a big X, no pets, women, children. I mean, that has to mean something to people if you really think about it. Exactly. So, and we also take these pesticides into our home. So one thing I do recommend, independently of the control you have over neighbors, is that you really want to have a rubber bucket outside your door And if you can get people to take their shoes off either in the door or outside the door and have a little more control. Pets are harder because your pets are running around lawns that may have pesticide, but if you wipe down their feet as they come in, depending on your animal. So there are ways to limit those exposures, and do not also separate the idea that we also have pesticides that we ourselves use for ants, bugs, mosquitoes in our own home that raises the risk of childhood lymphoma and leukemias.
Right.
Quite high, 47% risk increase if you have pesticides within your home intentionally. So you really want to avoid not just the pesticides outside or the pesticides that we actually spray on bugs, either inside or outside, but also the pesticides in our food. So we are really sort of enveloped with a lot of pesticides, and it's just a matter of not being overwhelmed, but lowering those exposures in a very smart and reasonable way.
Great. All right. So we have a lot of people that are asking about rheumatology and being in an integrative field. What are your suggestions for chronic patients now, traditional versus integrative? What can you offer? What can they do?
Okay, so there are about 120 types of arthritis, which really is a broad, very broad, all-day conference, essentially. But I'll give you my approach to most patients who come through the door in my office. Most people, regardless of what type of disease process they have, often are nutritionally insufficient. They're not getting what they need to actually support every process, not only the ones that are costing them illness and sickness. So, besides getting a very strong regular history of their symptoms and their past and their exposure to antibiotics and C-section or vaginal birth or recent use of medications or current use of medications, stress, sleep, and how all those play, the types of foods they eat, the type of drinking water they drink from, which is very, very undervalued as a conversation and very important. Aside some of those questions, I also like to get an environmental history. So what are they using for products? What are they using for food? What are their cooking utensils? Can we get rid of some cleaning products? Can we avoid some of the things, as I mentioned earlier, that take very little to no effort to get out of your life? In addition to all of the things that, your personal history of where you are. So, I think the key issue is that there's not enough discussion on a person's whole current experience. Where they spend their time, what they eat and drink, who they socialize, in terms of stress management with. So once people can share with me all that information, it helps me narrow down where we can make a dent in their life. And I have found that just tweaking, several things by just a small percentage even really adds to people's quality of life and can often decrease symptoms of various kinds. So that's very helpful before medications are on board, as long as they're not going to be sick without those specific medications. That's one thing that I have to balance as a rheumatologist and as an integrative medicine doctor, is certainly not to let patients get sick and not be on medicines that they really need to be on, or else it's really going to hurt them. So that's the balance.
Perfect. Yeah, it's all about preventative. And as you mentioned, decreasing the exposure is super important. But my part, I always tie it in. If your digestive system is working perfectly and you're able to eliminate properly, it's also have the job done. You are able to clear those toxins much better. So yes, my next question to you is about heavy metals and something like mercury or lead that harming our body. We are very concerned now with metals, metal toxicities. How do you feel about fish today, and is it safe to eat fish? What is your input?
So when people think of mercury, the first thing they think of, which is probably true to a large degree, is fish or seafood or shellfish. And that in fact is true, that we do get a large load of metals from, mercury, for instance, which is actually mercury turned into methyl mercury in the body of these fishes and plants. but we also get methylmercury from aerosolized, you know, air contaminants. So people, you know, pretty much even close to or near airports or places that are close to incinerators. Methylmercury is actually a combustion gas. It can be in combustion gas. And so we do get it in a lot of different places besides seafood. So again, you have to think about your whole living experience, where you live, where you work, how much driving you do on the freeway, and think about all those exposures, I believe, just as much as thinking about how much fish. Now, that being said, fish are notorious for having the contaminants that we think of that are harmful. So methylmercury, also bichlorinated PCBs, perchlorinated biphenyls, I'm sorry, which stands for PCBs. And those have been eliminated from much of our environment for many, many years, but they're persistent in the oceans.
Mm-hmm.
And so we now know that fish are not only taking up a lot of those contaminants from human populations, but also, you know, old remnant chemicals. So my recommendation generally with fish is to always try to go with as much wild caught fish as possible, which implies that those fish are out in the major wide ocean, caught by fishermen miles away from, you know, land and borders, so that we can at least try to get a better quality of fish from what they're eating and what they're taking in for their water sources. But if that's not possible, going with smaller fish, which tend to have lower levels of contaminants because they haven't done something called biomagnify up the food chain. So larger fish eat middle-sized fish eat little fish eat algae. And so all of those different exposures of eating fish makes the top fish, the largest fish, you know, like shark, tuna to some degree, a pretty good degree actually, and swordfish have very high levels on average of those chemicals because they've collected them over time. So small fish like sardines, salmon, if it's wild caught, is often very reasonable instead of farm raised fish, which is becoming more and more pervasive. So sticking with smaller fish, having less than 2 servings per week is my recommendation. It may differ for women who are pregnant, women, young children, because you look at body mass index, but I recommend on average no more than 2 servings of fish, 3 if it's a good high quality fish, low mercury level. Because we're now seeing that it's not just the benefits of fish that we want, which is good protein and antioxidants and omega-3 fish oils, but the problem is it's coming along with some of the contaminants that we don't want. So we have to balance that exposure out with nutrition.
And you feel this way about the seafood as well?
Yeah, well, yeah, seafood, you know, some fish such as clams and mollusks can be on the bottom of the sea floor, which is where a lot of sediment comes down from the surface. So you don't necessarily know where your fish is coming from. That's a downside, right? It doesn't come with the tag. It doesn't have a made in. And, you know, you go to certain food stores and they don't often, you know, necessarily give you all the information or know the information that you want. So again, being on the low risk, you know, risk averse side of things, precautionary principle per se, I would say always try to stick to smaller fish, wild caught when possible, when on sale, when available. And also cleaning off the fat of fish is another added cooking mechanism by which you're going to get a lot of chemicals off, because fat holds on to many of these chemicals quite nicely. So you don't want the fat. You want to cook that off in meat, poultry, and fish.
Yeah, that's a very great tip. I actually, was discussing with some of my clients, and they were telling me how they cannot afford their salmon to be wild, and that would be something to do. Get rid of the fatty part.
Right, exactly. That's at least something to do instead of, exactly.
Yes, and we're sticking with 2 or 3 if it's for like a great quality sardine.
Well, like I said, you have to use your own judgment. I certainly don't make it cut and dry. Some people, you know, have wonderful quality fish and can, you know, certain cultures eat fish for the majority of their diet. And so these all have to be tempered out with your culture and the availability of that food, and the cost of that food, accessibility. So a lot of factors go in. I kind of use a lot of general rules just to emphasize the points to think about.
Right. Great. Great. So I have a really important last question for you. How can my listeners and readers find out more about you, about your work, more information about you?
Thank you so much. So, actually, I'm practicing. I just moved my practice to Princeton, New Jersey. Previously, I was in South Jersey, or I should say high South Jersey, but where I'm in Princeton, New Jersey. I can give you my website for my medical practice, which I do see children. I do see patients with everything from migraines to Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, to all the autoimmune diseases, gout, diet, weight loss, all those things. And that website is Aly Cohen, COHENMD.com. So AlyCohenMD.com. The work that I'm doing in environmental health and my recommendations in terms of personal care products and great, practical tidbits on what people can do on a day-to-day basis to feel empowered. That website is thesmarthuman.com, thesmarthuman.com. And I post Monday, Wednesday, Friday on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please feel free to have, people check it out, your patients. I don't sell anything. I don't endorse anything. I'm very clean because I do a lot of academic work. I hope that my recommendations are weighted very cleanly. And so I hope people will follow and learn a little chunk of information every couple of days that I think is very, very practical and useful for every type of person, no matter who you are.
Perfect. Thank you. We really, really appreciate you. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I enjoy it.
And all this such helpful information that people really,
Sure.
really need to know and find out. And again, Inna is here with you. If you guys are interested in grabbing my book, just email me at Inna, INNA, at digestivereset.com, and I'll send you a copy of my book. And for now, thank you and take care.
Thank you, Inna. Appreciate it.